play the whole song?
No, we don't.
We could.
I can see clearly now.
For background, the song is a bit random, but I've been listening to it sort of on repeat these days.
I can see all obstacles in my way.
It's a good 2020 song for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Clouds that had me blind.
But I don't think
It's
Rain
gonna be a
is
bright, sunshiny day. It's gonna be a bright, sunshiny day. I think I can make it now. The pain is gone. All of the bad feelings have disappeared.
super good.
Here is that rainbow I've been praying.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to stop sharing the sound. We are so excited to welcome Pulane Mpotokwane from all the way from Botswana. And Pulane and I were, of course, undergraduates together at Princeton University. And she, you know, it feels like a long time ago. It was 10 years ago we graduated. And she then got a Master of Science in Sustainable Environmental Design from the Architectural Association Graduate School. And Pulane has worked at Arup on sustainability consulting, urban design, and project planning and building retrofit in cities like Johannesburg, Gaborone, and Mauritius. In 2018, Pulane founded Botala Design, a sustainable design consultancy that delivers context-specific built environment solutions. And she is an accredited professional with the Green Building Council of South Africa. So we're so excited that you're here, Pulane. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So we have some questions for you, and we'll go ahead and get started. Mark, I'll give you the first question.
Okay, it's an well, maybe not an easy one, but it's just to check in. How are you? And how the last month's been in Botswana?
The last few months here have been very challenging, as I'm sure they have been all over the world. We've been in and out of lockdowns for the past few months, but I think we've generally adjusted well to this new normal that we're all being forced to live in. In terms of the business, there've been a lot of ups and downs. Obviously, a lot of projects have been shelved for the time being. You know, I think a lot of clients are concerned about, you know, their financial futures. And, you know, construction has been halted during lockdowns and things like that. So it's been a challenging few months, especially for a young business like Botala Design. But we're managing, and we're trying to figure out, you know, how to move forward. One nice thing that not a nice thing, but I think one bright light that's come out of this pandemic is that a lot of people are now sort of realizing the importance of sustainability and, you know, sort of becoming more independent from energy grids and water resources and things like that. So I think what we found in the last few months is a lot more people are interested in becoming energy independent, going off grid and things like that, which has been nice for the consultancy. But otherwise, yeah, just sort of rolling with the punches and trying to stay positive and trying to figure out how we can move forward in a way that's useful for people, you know, both during this challenging time and for the future. So I personally have no complaints. It's the last few months have given me an opportunity to sort of lean into things like meditation, just to keep the stress at bay. And yeah, I don't know, I've found it to be a pretty nice, like, self-reflective time personally. So yeah.
That's
How
great.
about you guys? Are you both in New York City, by the way?
I'm in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Mark is in California.
I'm in Los Angeles, yeah.
Okay.
Is this the first time you revealed that, Mark?
Publicly, yes. No, I came here not mid-pandemic, not too long ago, a month ago or so.
Yeah.
So I wish I had that kind of calm, meditative spirit. I'm more like, oh my God, what do I do? But yeah.
So tell us more about Botala Design and Sustainable Design Consultancy. And I'll go ahead and share the screen with your the principles. So tell us how you thought of starting it and what we should know about.
Okay. So while I was with Arup, I was in the Johannesburg office and Gaborone office and Mauritius office between 2014 and 2018. I started becoming, we were obviously working on environmental sustainability and working on large-scale projects to do with that. But I started growing more and more interested in sort of the socio-economic aspects of sustainability, sort of how building projects and developments were influencing the communities that people were living in. And I found that the longer that I was working on sort of big commercial buildings, which is what Arup is famous for, the more I became interested in sort of smaller scale residential community-oriented projects. And so I decided to start up my own consultancy that would be able to focus more on that aspect of things, sort of on community development, which is so important in this part of the world, and I think in the global South in general. We still have so much sort of city building and space making assignments ahead of us. And I just think that we need to pay a little bit more attention to how, communities can be influenced and can influence design as well. And so, that's why I decided to create this diagram that encompasses not only the environmental aspects of sustainability, also the spatial as well, but then sort of focusing more on the community sort of interpersonal aspects. And, things like that include, things like accessibility for differently abled people, and also trying to see how you can enhance local cultures and informal economies, and also seeing how, for instance, like different urban developments affect women and children in different ways and different vulnerable groups, how they can sort of be, how they can grow those communities and sort of support those different groups, as opposed to just imposing like a bigger sort of commercial capitalistic vision. So yeah, that's how I got started with Botala Design.
That's so important, because oftentimes architecture, I feel like, is funded by capital that comes from, wealth, essentially. And so, one way of looking at it is that it is physicalizing existing power structures, and how do we kind of move away from that and take a holistic approach for the planet, and also for people who may not always be seen as like the primary constituents of the work that is being done. Do you work with other architects, or do you, design and construct yourself? Like, what would be the vision for how you imagine this work playing out?
Yeah, so Botala Design, the way that we're structured is we work with other independent designers, architects and urban designers and different engineers. And the idea is that depending on what the project is, it could be an interior design project, it could be a small scale residential project, it could be a commercial project. But depending on the project, we're privileged enough to have a network of professionals that we can call upon and work with as the need arises, which I find to be like a more sustainable, excuse the pun, approach to doing things, as opposed to having like a set team for every single project, just because, each project is unique and, has different needs and so on.
I'm curious to hear, like, I'm just thinking about architecture school, especially like in America, and like how removed sustainability and any kind of discussions of these really important things is from education. And I was wondering if that was the same, at least at Princeton. I felt like there were no like required courses on sustainability or anything like that. Was that the case at the GSD, Vikas? And I know you went specifically to the AA for sustainability, but is that integrated into their architecture curriculum?
Alani, do you want to? I will just say that at the GSD, it felt like a checklist, right? Like you had to check enough boxes to graduate. And so, yeah, sustainability was part of that. And part of the problem is the best thing we have to ensure sustainable stuff is LEED. And it's maybe like 10, 15 years old or more. And I feel like it's very surface level. It doesn't really get to the bottom of like, how do we change the way we build so that we can sustain the planet? And also, how do we talk about people who are not at the center of these conversations and bring them in and build for them? I don't know, what was the AA like, Pulane?
Well, so my program, as you said, Mark, was focused on sustainable environmental design. And the beautiful thing about this particular master's program is we really focused on first principles. So the first thing we did for every project was look at the climate and looked at what, you know, sort of materials work best in that climate, how much natural ventilation or daylighting you needed. And we focused on things like designing for seasons. So for instance, I guess in a place like New York, Vikas, where you are, winter is the main design season, whereas in a place like Botswana, summer is the main design season. And so we sort of went through, instead of going through the LEED checklist, as I know a lot of people do for projects, we sort of look at it on a more high level. And then, and I find that if you do that, all of the downstream effects are sort of easier to incorporate. Like it doesn't become an afterthought, or it doesn't become an issue of, you know, checking things off a box. Every single aspect of the design is tailored towards that climate. And I find that if you do that, then you start to rely less on things like air conditioning and heating, and you improve the occupant comfort of buildings, for instance. And I think, you know, the current pandemic has also shown us that, you know, things like natural ventilation are really important for buildings. And I feel like in general, that's not really something that's considered to be important to architects. It's sort of like, oh yeah, you know, maybe throw in a few openable windows at the end if the design allows it. But we sort of, the aesthetic for us in the master's program ended up being the very last consideration. You know, the first thing we considered was building orientation, window to floor ratio, and things like that, and just how people occupied the buildings. Because I think a lot of the time we forget that human beings were animals, first of all, and we experience space and live in spaces in a very particular way. And what I really enjoyed about the program that I was in is that we were designing first and foremost for the human animal and trying to ensure our comfort above everything else.
Yeah, that's so important.
Yeah.
So I will let people who have joined us know that if you have any questions during the conversation, feel free to put them in the chat and be part of the conversation. The next thing we want to ask you, Pulane, is why did you choose this Heatherwick project to talk about today?
Yeah. That is a good question. There's a lot of things about this project that I found interesting. First of all, I mean, this image that you put up right now, Vikas, just the very striking visual that it presents, I found quite compelling. When the project was completed in 2017, there was a lot of buzz around the architectural community in Southern Africa, and I think internationally, about this project. And I found it interesting as a refurbishment project, as a museum project as well. I'm somebody who really enjoys going to museums and galleries. I love contemporary art, which is what this museum focuses on. And I was also interested in how, or I am interested in how public buildings relate to the cities that they're located in. And I just thought it would be fun to discuss those different aspects of this project. Also, Heatherwick is a very interesting design studio in my opinion. I mean, they design everything from postage stamps to buildings, you know, and buses and things like that. And so I really enjoy the way that they're so playful with their projects, and also that for them, design is really not it's not limited to scale. It's just a matter of how you think about things and how you know, what vision you're trying to implement. And another thing, to be honest as well, this project received a lot of mixed reviews when it was first constructed. I think a lot of people were really congratulatory about the fact that it was a refurbishment project, and you know, the striking visuals that it ended up producing. But there was a lot of criticism also about how it didn't really necessarily relate to its context. It wasn't necessarily speaking to Cape Town as a city, which has a very long and complicated history. And so, yeah, I thought it would be a fun project to discuss with the two of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of are you hearing this weird sound when I talk?
No.
Okay, good. So yeah, Le Corbusier in Towards a New Architecture writes about grain silos. So there's this architectural history embedded within it. And you know, I was reading, what is a grain silo? It's essentially a storage space. And so to go in and carve that into this monumental interior atrium also reminds me of Gordon Mata Clark and his operations, you know, in Paris and in the United States. So it's a fascinating project. Yeah, just really interesting to see both like the rawness of how it's imagined, but then also the precision with which it's finished. You know, there's an aesthetic quality to it that is really striking as well, I think, that Heatherwick projects have. So yeah, absolutely fascinating.
Definitely. And one of the interesting things about this project is, like you were saying, these silos were storage units for grain. And so these buildings were never meant to be inhabited by people, right? They weren't supposed to be open to the public. And so I think it's really sort of dynamic and interesting the way that Heatherwick Studios created this space that draws people in so powerfully. It's quite subversive as well, I think.
Yeah, and it's weird. It's interesting to see that some people thought it didn't belong because how could it not belong? It was already there. And in that sense, you know, it's kind of carving out into the infrastructure that already is part of the city, which to me is really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. How do you mean people didn't think it belonged?
Well, I think I understood that some of the criticism was that it didn't match like it didn't speak to Cape Town as a city. And so I guess it was the additions that Heatherwick brought to it, or the way in which a very functional building was turned into a rarefied kind of elite institution. Yeah, have you been to this museum?
I have not had the chance to visit this museum. I really wanted to go. I've wanted to go for a couple of years now, but I haven't had the chance to visit yet. And I think, I mean, what you were saying, Vikas, about it not speaking to Cape Town as a city, I think that's probably true on the urban scale, much more than it is like in terms of the building itself. You know, Cape Town is a beautiful city full of very interesting and layered colonial and historical architecture. And so I think a refurb project in that context that's been made to be so contemporary and so sort of fresh does really sit well in terms of Cape Town as a design city. It's a very creative city that's full of very sort of forward-thinking, design-minded people. But I think a lot of the criticism was about how it doesn't really speak to its wider context, both in the V&A waterfront where it's located and in terms of the wider city.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's me. Is that me that's doing that weird noise?
Could be, but we can still hear you.
You can hear me?
Yeah. And see you.
You can see me, great. So I was gonna say, like, I don't know, I was reading a little bit about some criticisms of it, and that, like, more generally in kind of like colonial, post-colonial places, there's always a kind of question of like whether certain structures stand as a symbol of this colonization, and if they should even be reused in the first place, or just like completely demolished and built anew. So I don't know is that like just a kind of like intellectual conversation that's not really maybe the views of locals, or have you heard any kind of similar discussions?
I think a lot of, from what I've read and from what I've heard from different people, there's no disagreement with the fact that they should have refurbished an old industrial building and repurposed it into something new. But I think what this project missed is sort of, as a contemporary art museum, you would think that they would have more of a conversation with South Africa's apartheid past. You would think that they would maybe engage a little bit more with the racist urban planning that Cape Town and other cities and towns in South Africa were founded on. Cape Town is a very racially segregated city. 60% of the residents who are Black tend to live on the outskirts of the city in places that are called townships, a lot of which are informal settlements, whereas most of the white population lives in the city center where this museum is located, and sort of have much more access to the sort of wealthier development areas where, for example, where Zeitz is located. And so I think an opportunity that there was a missed opportunity in terms of speaking to that reality on the urban scale, and the fact that, for instance, the top part of the museum, where you can see those big convex windows, is a luxury hotel. And the hotel rooms apparently go for between $900 and $10,000 a night, which would be unaffordable in lots of cities, but especially in a place like Cape Town, where there's so much socioeconomic inequality, a lot of which is founded on a race basis. I think this museum sort of didn't interrogate that reality. It sort of just lent into it and almost perpetuated the existing status quo. And I, for one, as somebody who's interested in museum culture, as somebody who's interested in architecture, I think it's really important for cultural institutions to sort of, if not directly confront those realities, then to create spaces where discussions about those realities can be had in a real way. And I think that's one big opportunity that this institution missed out on.
It's also like designed by a British guy.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is also located in the Victoria and Albert waterfront, which is named after a former Queen of England. So the colonial history is rife throughout the project. But one thing that I did find when I was looking up this project is that one of the developers who was involved in the planning of the project actually approached Thomas Heatherwick and asked him if he could become involved. So it's not like it was an open project. I don't believe there was any competition. So I don't know. I don't know how much we can critique that aspect of it, but yeah.
So here's an image that you shared with us, Pulane, that shows just how much inequality that exists in Cape Town, right?
Yeah. This cover is actually a photo of two neighborhoods in Johannesburg. I mean, I chose this one just because it was a Time magazine cover. There are lots of images like this on a website called unequalscenes.com, which is a website run by a photographer named Johnny Miller, who takes drone photographs of different cities around the world just to showcase from an aerial perspective, you know, the difference between the haves and the have-not. And in South Africa, this reality of the majority Black population living in informal settlements, like what you see on the right side of the screen, versus how white residents will live in, you know, in wealthier neighborhoods. And, you know, they can just be divided by a highway. It's that stark of a difference. But I thought it was important to highlight this just to understand the apartheid urban planning of Cape Town and South Africa in general, and to understand that even though apartheid ended in 1994, when South Africa became a democracy, the realities of apartheid urban planning are still very much in existence and influencing people's everyday lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have in the United States as well, where a lot of the really deep historical issues that are part of this country's history are still present. And, you know, you see that in urban planning, you see that in home ownership, you see that in the way institutions work, whose stories are told. And I think architecture, even though it doesn't speak explicitly, it does give signals to what kinds of stories we're going to encounter in, let's say, this particular museum. And it is surprising to hear that the developers involved, you know, have this luxury hotel planned, kind of coupled or almost fused with the museum. That to me signals that, you know, there's a certain kind of audience that they have in mind. And maybe that audience is not the people who live in the informal settlements. And even if it is, it's going to be hard to convey that because the architecture is sending some signals, you know, through its form and through, I guess, materiality and you know, all of these ways in which it's speaking to the city. So that to me is fascinating. Reminds me of another Heatherwick project that is highly contested, at least within the architecture community in New York, as being part of Hudson Yards, which is a super luxury, you know, neighborhood / block that used a lot of public funding that was meant for low-income housing and things like that, you know, and instead created a highly commercial space. So that's, I mean, it's interesting to see, you know, it's interesting to see how architecture, it's hard to draw a straight line, but does become complicit in certain, I guess, power structures that persist.
Definitely.
This thing, I honestly do not understand how that was ever built.
Like that today's
Budget too, like the cost for it, it's just total insanity to me because it's not even, can't even go up high. Have you been?
I
What-
have not
what
been,
is-
I've been right across.
It's
What
like
is the structure? What is going on there?
it's like a looping staircase.
It's like, you know, like Eiffel Tower, like it's nothing, it's just a place to go and like have views. I guess it's a similar concept, yeah. That would be a very generous way of talking about it, in my view.
Yeah, which in itself is a very sort of luxurious use of resources.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know, all cities deserve like public spaces where people can go and really just bask in like the beauty of architecture. But, you know, this is the most exclusive part of town. It's not even in like Queens or Staten Island or whatever, somewhere in Brooklyn. It's, you know, right, it's a development project to, I guess, to get a return on investment, and then art becomes a vehicle for that to happen. Sadly. But it's, you know, I think a lot of Heatherwick's actual works are quite beautiful, and we should come back to that. If it's okay, I would like to introduce the next project that we are talking about today, and that is Antoni Gaudí in Barcelona, and we're talking about the Sagrada Familia. Let me see if I can find the image. So here he is, and the building that we are talking about is a large, unfinished Roman Catholic minor basilica in Barcelona. And here you can see, I believe that the man in the beard is Gaudí, and in the background is the church under construction. And you can see another image of it under construction here. After a visit to the Vatican in 1872, Boccabella, who was a bookseller, returned from Italy, and he had the intention to build this thing. And he hired an architect who eventually dropped out. And I'm not sure, I mean, how these things worked at that time, but the church was already under construction when Gaudí took on and kind of changed what it was going to look like. And basically his style was a combination of Gothic and the modernist Art Nouveau. And I think very much like Heatherwick, it's a very individualistic style of like the personal signature of the work. But whereas Heatherwick is about excavation, this one is about, I would say, aggregation, adding on more and more things. And here we're seeing a model that he built to study the structure of, and this is a very Gothic operation where all the arches and all the columns lead the forces down, and the goal is to make the columns as thin and elegant as possible. So he's kind of experimenting here on the left. And then when you invert it, you know what kind of structure you need that's going to support itself. And so you begin to see how this building comes into formation. And then here are some images. I heard that until recently, the building did not even have a permit in the city of Barcelona, and that only recently it received that. And its final kind of construction is now underway to actually finish the project after so many years.
It just seems so, I mean, talk about like excess and like how did this thing get made? I was watching like a little animation of what was the planned remainder of the construction. And I was just like, what, I mean, it just looks like more, it just, you know what I mean? It could be done already. Just put a cap on it.
So the white,
the more spires you add, the more it just looks like a wider version of itself.
Yeah.
Not changing much. Sorry, that's my hot take.
And then there are like Japanese architects and craftsmen like working to finish this thing, and the white parts in this model show, you know, which parts are still incomplete, including this tallest structure in the center. And here is the base from which it will be built. So, and then here's another construction image of that. So if we go back to some of the images, like you can imagine like what's missing in this image is the tallest possible, like, you know, cone that's gonna rise in the center. So yeah, it's any reactions, Pulane, to this building? What do you think about it?
So I actually have had the opportunity to visit La Sagrada Familia. During my master's program, we took a field trip to Barcelona, which was incredible. And I went to this building fully prepared to critique it, fully prepared to not like it. But what I found is that it is an extremely personable space. I found that Gaudí's attention to detail and his sort of, his very fantastical vision and all the opulence and all the details that went into the building just made me feel like, even though it's such a big grand space, it actually felt very intimate, and it felt like I think a church should, in that there was a lot of light, the temperature was just right, and there was a lot of I don't know how else to put this, but there was a lot of really positive spiritual energy, which I recognize isn't really something that you can quantify or describe on a Zoom call. But I found that the experience of this building was the thing that made me like it the most. The style is a little bit opulent for my personal taste, but I think that his sort of, the way that he emphasized nature and he emphasized organic lines and curves. And I don't know, I read somewhere that there were hardly any straight lines in this church at all. All of the lines were organic or curved. And I just found his sort of the dedication to this vision to be really inspiring. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's an anomaly. Obviously, it's a very unique vision. It's unlike any building I've ever seen. But I kind of understand what he was going for, and I don't know. It's one of those things that I feel like, as an as an architectural designer, I feel like I should have a lot more critiques for. But I loved it. I loved being there. And I also like the way that he sort of broke from Barcelona's urban grid, which is very particular. Barcelona has very specific, I don't know what you call them. I guess it's blocks, city blocks, where the buildings are always, and on a city block, the buildings are sort of on the periphery, and the middle of the city block is a garden or a courtyard. And this, and all the buildings are roughly the same height. But the Sagrada Familia sort of breaks away from all of that. And I think that as a church that is aiming to draw people in to come and worship, I sort of understood why he would want it to stand out and why he would want it to be sort of an attention drawing monument. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think that he was a religious man, and you can see the passion, the devotion, the kind of lifetime of commitment to this project to the very end, and to create something that is almost or truly impossible to imagine, right? And so, and that speaks to everyone, and speaks to people, and it's the most visited site in the city, and so many people go there, are drawn to it. And I think that's the power of architecture, is to show us, kind of bring us together, and I guess it's the magic of architecture, and to make us believe in something that I think is really powerful.
I guess, this is something that we have later in the questions, but I think it's relevant now. We're just talking so much about like Gaudí, right? And I guess the question is, like, generally, like, what do we think when a singular person is, takes all the credit for a project, even if they are sort of visionary, or it is their vision? Like, is that okay? Because, like, obviously Sagrada Familia, he worked on it for what, from the 30 years before he like died, right? And now it's like some 90 years later, and it's still being executed and attributed to himself. I don't know. I feel like there's something to discuss about like architecture, personalities, or architects that exist, actually well before this, especially in regards to the Catholic Church with or like construction of these things, right? There's like always been these kind of master architects that take the credit for all the kind of labor and other design work that goes into it.
Mm-hmm. And there's also the question of who gets to be the creative mastermind. Yeah. Like, somebody who doesn't have to worry about the basic necessities of life, of like having to, you know, make a living and whatnot. Like you need that level of, either you have to be crazy enough or you have to be comfortable enough to be able to devote your time to being this, just, you know, obsessive. And so, yeah, it was almost 40 years of his life working on this. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. Like architecture, which is such a collaborative discipline, how do we contend with individual heroes or star architects like Gaudí and Heatherwick?
Mm. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
I mean, I think I just wonder if it's like preventable or if it's just an inevitability or like how, like what, why it's even a thing. Like, does a work of architecture need to be attributed to like a singular person in order to promote it or publicize it or get funding or etc. Like, I guess the dream is to like be able to form a sort of like collective that, or various collaborations that could produce something so monumental as this church. But is that just wishful thinking?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I wonder though, I mean, with something like La Sagrada Familia, it's such a specific and unique vision that I almost feel like that vision is what we attribute credit to. The people who constructed it, maybe they were master stonemasons and engineers and so on, but they wouldn't have known what to do without that initial designer's vision. And so I have a really hard time sort of dividing the vision from the creation. Yeah, and thinking about it as a collaboration, because it's almost like, in some ways, like architecture is a very, and I hope I don't offend anyone by saying this, but it's a very godlike activity, right? From when you draw a plan or a perspective or whatever, and you have it realized, that initial idea, isn't that like the most valuable or the most sort of wide-reaching aspect of any project, really? Mm-hmm. I wonder.
Yeah, and there's also when we are when it comes time to convincing people to fund something and to support a project, it helps to have like a figure, like a Frank Gehry or a Zaha Hadid, who we can say, it's their vision. So stop questioning whether or not it's going to be, X, Y, or Z. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be priceless, but because what you're getting is a masterpiece, from like this person. So I think it's a question of branding and turning it. I mean, this is completely opposite of like the spiritual aspect, but how do we turn it into a product and actually get it built? I think there's the aura of the artist helps with that. I feel like in the real world, whether it is Gaudí or it's
I just feel like it sets up
angles, right?
It sets up like it sets up students or all architects to either like actually 99.999% of architects then are going to be disappointed with their like careers or lives or something, because it's not easily attainable. It is a combination of luck and privilege and timing and all these things. You know what I mean? It just seems like there's so many people that go kind of like under recognized that it's a weird sort of cultural thing that I think is
and not just that, I feel like the people who look like this could be like a really famous, wonderful architect tend to be white men, right? and tend to look a certain way, have a kind of image. And so that is another layer that adds to this issue of like, how do we make not just architecture available to more people, but the practice of architecture. Who gets to take on that godlike role of creating the spaces for the next generation, and spaces that would last, and kind of really set the stage for life to happen in the next, I don't know how many years. That's like really interesting.
Yeah. How do you guys feel about projects like the High Line in New York, which is obviously like a highly successful project that lots of people, the public and critics alike love, but it's such a quiet intervention. It doesn't scream of sculpturalism. It doesn't really draw attention to itself. It more so highlights the surrounding city. So I don't know, I find that to be like a useful contrast to these big sculptural projects.
That's interesting. It's Liz had to build the shed at the end of the High Line in order to get that. Or something,
Really interesting.
like because maybe it didn't have enough personality or brand identity that we need to build a giant structure like the shed to do it. I don't know.
Yeah, I really like the High Line. I think no project is going to be perfect. But having said that, I think the landscape element of it, like being close to nature within the city, is really powerful. The public nature of it, that you can simply climb up a series of steps and just be in a completely different world, is great. But the High Line has become a site of gentrification, and new architecture is now surrounding it that is extremely elite. So it raised kind of the overall profile of that part of the city. But in general, I feel like the High Line is indeed, I agree, a really nice contrast. And the collaboration between field operations and Diller's Scofidio, I think, is really powerful as well. And it shifts away.
Wasn't Piet Udolf the actual like landscaper? Like the one who landscape, I don't think he's even a landscape architect. I think he's like I don't know, he's got a plant picker or something. Like he's the one who planted the space, which I think is like one of the most impressive parts about it. Yeah. But again, it's sort of like I don't know, you don't hear about that character.
So so the space is open for anybody to mention anything else about these two buildings that hasn't been said yet, or ask a question. And then we have two kind of fun sections of the conversation that we're going to move to.
Great. I was just curious because you guys sort of asked me to pick a project and then you responded. So I picked the museum and you responded with the church. I was just wondering what inspired that decision?
To be honest, it was a really instinctive like visual thing, like seeing this and being like, yeah, it's gonna be Gaudí and it's gonna be the Sagrada Familia, because there is something so impossible about these two projects, like it's monumental, and also this idea of the artist architect that both embody. And then the contrast, of course, is one is a project of excavation and the other is a project of like heaping on more and more and more. So I think that was my thinking. Mark, what were you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, August proposed this to us and I was like, great. No, I think the kind of like formal, like, first of all, I had never seen this project actually, the Heatherwick project. And I didn't understand it when I first saw it. And I think that there's a sort of quality of fascination or kind of drama to it that both projects have. and then yeah, the kind of like I don't know, the artist architect this thing is also kind of interesting, and it's something we haven't really talked about. Not the kind of like singular person, but the relation to art of the designs, right? That like they are somehow not just functional, and like what does that mean? I guess for architects to do kind of like more sculptural things with their designs themselves.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of just curious, like, I mean, and this is a question for both of you, which is, you know, all three of us went to architecture school, and I'm sure at some point we had, great, aspirations of becoming architects and designers and so on. But how I found that my understanding of the profession has sort of shifted the further away I've gotten from school. And I feel a lot more sort of responsibility for the community that I live in and that I want to do work in. And I'm just wondering, like, what are your feelings about that? Like, what responsibility do you think architects, and architects maybe in particular, have to the community that they function in, or that they live in, or that they design within? I mean, I feel like it shouldn't just be about realizing your project, realizing your sculpture and moving on. Like, I think you have to understand the impact that you're making on a space with your intervention. And I'm just curious how you guys feel, how you guys relate to that.
I think I'm, fairly recent out of school, and I think pretty quickly have, and I don't know if there's so much time for reflection or something, but I've just grown more and more sort of disappointed with the education system here, or like what we learn. Like, not even, like, I know we have like required courses that kind of cover these things, but there wasn't, there wasn't like it wasn't part of the culture in school to like be excited or talk about these things, or even talk about like, not even sustainability, but like a human, a person, like how experience relates to architecture. Like the word phenomenology was like taboo, and like maybe still is, but it's, to me, it's like one of the most important aspects of like a building is just like how is like the human experience within it. So I don't know, I feel like I'm a bit frustrated with that, and personally, and questioning my relation to with architecture in general. So I'm all over the place. I don't know. Vikas, what about you?
Yeah, I always think back to my very first studio, which was at Princeton, and it was a super confusing time for me. And we were doing a sustainable project with Jane Harrison, and she said, right? She said,
that.
architecture is what you make of it. Like, it can be anything. So every time I'm like, oh no, this is not what I thought I would be doing, or oh yes, this is really exciting, I'm like, architecture is what you make of it. So I think that has been my guiding kind of principle. And like you said, Pulane, Heatherwick is doing everything from furniture to like gigantic buildings. It's really about, designing. But I do think that, I also think back to something that Oprah Winfrey said, which is when she was starting her career, she was looking at Barbara Walters, who was this superstar, like, I don't know, news anchor or something. And for a long time, she tried to be the next Barbara Walters. And then one day she realized that I can never be as good at Barbara Walters as the actual one. Like, I need to be the next Oprah. Like, I need to be the best thing that I can be. So like, I feel like, now we are living in a world where we're faced with climate change. We're faced with a lot of income inequality, and all of these problems are linked, right? Because climate change is a symptom of unequal distribution of resources. of a colonial past. And so contending with all of that means that new people are needed in the conversation, because no matter how much you research and learn about these things, there is no substitution for lived experience. So I think that, you know, we all have a role to play in how we talk about architecture. And maybe we won't be at the level of like Gaudí and Heatherwick, and that's fine. But I think we can begin to imagine ourselves as part of a constellation of different people thinking and working along the lines that the world needs architects to be, as opposed to, you know, what our profession tells us we should be. So yeah, I think that's how I think about it.
Yeah. No, that idea of a constellation really resonates with me. A lot of the people I work with are also interested in this idea of a design collective rather than a design individual, like we might imagine with the star architects. And I think we really do, I think it's useful to move towards like a more collective, communal vision of the spaces that we're trying to create, as opposed to just, I want to put my stamp on something, or, yeah. But also, Vikas, I'm really curious with Isometric Studio, with your graphic design work, you do a lot of work with museums as well. And I'm just curious, like, what is your perception? Do we have too many high hopes for what cultural institutions should be doing? You know, like the critique against Zeitz is that it hasn't done enough as a contemporary art institution to critique the place that it exists in. Is that a little bit sort of, is that unreasonable for us to expect that they would do that? Or how do you think institutions see themselves, or what is their function?
Yeah, I think that institutions are very important and have a really key role to play in mediating social frameworks. I think, you know, when the Louvre, after the French Revolution, the Louvre turned from like a palace to a museum, and that signified a shift in society. It became more democratic, open to the public. And so I think of it as kind of an all of the above approach, where we need to continue demanding from museums to do better and holding them accountable. And if they are not doing that, to shame them, to boycott them, whatever needs to happen, right?
Right.
But at the same time, also explore alternative ways of making culture. But the powerful thing about institutions is that they are so long-lasting. And there is this thing about stability that they bring to a society. And I think that that's really powerful. So if we can change how institutions function, then we're making a much longer term change. So I do think there is value to Zeitz MoCA, and to hopefully it evolving to become more and more reflective of the city in which it sits, as well as creating alternative venues for art to happen. Looking at some of the questions here, do you feel that people building architecture outside of your own practice in South Africa is changing? Curious to know if folks here know about movements within or without architecture academia to adapt the curriculum profession to meet the needs of the moment. Yes, there are things underway. I know of collectives in the United States, like professors and you know, professionals who are coming together to demand better representation and different curriculum. Which also brings us to one topic we actually didn't get to discuss is, you know, we want architecture education to be more reflective of different cultures, but how do we do that without cultural appropriation? Do you have any thoughts on that, Pulane?
On how to be creative without appropriating other people's cultures?
Yes, or how to be inclusive. Let's say at Princeton, instead of learning about just Corbusier and Mies and whatever, like we had some, you know, architectural education of, you know, precedents from India or,
right.
Or
Yeah, that is, I think Personally, I think that is something that we missed out on, in that we were focused exclusively on the Western canon. And recently, I'm sure you read this email from President Eisgruber Vakas, but recently Princeton has started a sort of racial diversity committee in which they're trying to explore different ways in which the curriculum can be updated to reflect not only its student community, but the world in which it exists in, right? It's not just about pale white male architects anymore, right? Or I forget how that phrase goes. And I don't know, I think it's important to look at different cultures. I think it's important to look at different ways of creation. I mean, I know a lot of architecture, for example, that's associated with Africa isn't associated with architects or with a particular name. It's much more like a certain tribe will have developed a certain style, usually in connection with whatever climate that tribe happened to exist in, whatever the natural resources of the land were that were available to them. And so I personally think that looking at indigenous design, indigenous architecture, and also again going back to that idea of building for your climate, as opposed to trying to match for example, a modernist vision with steel and glass, just as an example. I think going back to your particular context, looking at your looking at your climate, looking at the local materials, looking at what sort of lifestyle the people that you're designing for require, again, looking at the socioeconomic condition that you're operating in. I think all of those things can help us move away from sort of this modernist track that that at least you and I, Vakas, was very much educated in.
Absolutely.
And we thought that, architecture with a capital A was modernism or was Western or European or whatever. And we are now learning in practice that that's not necessarily the case. But I hope that, people who are in architecture schools right now are being taught that and don't have to discover it on their own. But I really do think that the way to do that, not only in architecture, but also in music and in art and in graphic design and in all creative endeavors, is to really just go to the community that you're working within and listen to them. Listen to what they need, listen to what they want, listen to what their real problems are, and don't impose your existing vision or your existing conceptualization of what those people are and what they want might be. Just looking at this first question from Hannah, she was asking whether people building architecture in South Africa, whether the way they're practicing is changing, if I understand that correctly. And I would say yes. I think a lot of people, a lot of architects, I think I know mostly about the Johannesburg context because that's where I lived and worked. But a lot of Joburg architects are now looking much more into informal settlements and trying to understand how they can sort of be regenerated and refurbished to become, to improve the public spaces that are there, to improve the service provision, to improve safety is a really big thing, the safety of children and women. In a lot of these places, there's not adequate service provision. So you might find that people don't have indoor plumbing, they may not have electricity. And so simple things like walking home from work at night could provide a really dangerous situation if you live on a dark street that doesn't have street lights, for instance. It's really basic things like that I think people, more and more architects are starting to look at and to try to think of ways, through things like maybe, solar panels, through renewable energy, through alternative ways, alternative means of meeting needs. I think people are really trying to look at upgrading or refurbishing those sort of settlements. And I think people are also moving away from the idea of architecture as like a single sculptural building and thinking about how it works within its neighborhood, what it's adding again to that urban environment, which is amazing. And if you guys, I don't know how much you guys follow South African architecture, but there's some really, really interesting work that's going on there that I would encourage everybody to check out if you haven't yet.
That's great. That's great. Thanks for sharing. I think with that, we will move to the lightning round of questions, which are supposed to be really fun, hopefully. And it's an either or answer. So we'll ask Pulane to say your answer, and then people in the, who are in the call can type your answer in the chat.
We'll do an abridged quick round. Okay, so they're either or questions, and then I'll count to 3 at the end, and then we could all blurt out our answers. So the first is open-toed or closed-toed? Open-toed or closed-toed? 1, 2, 3, open.
Open-toed.
Oh, close. Do you have weird toes, Vikas?
No, it's just, I don't know. I don't know why. Maybe it's the climate here.
I don't know. I get really, I feel like all my heat is in my foot. And when my feet are really hot, I'm really hot. So that's my take on that. Okay. Sorry, a little TMI. Hello or goodbye? Hello or goodbye? 1, 2, 3. Hello.
Hello. Yes.
Goodbyes are very sad.
Okay.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
Everybody agreed on that one. Okay. Loud or quiet? Loud or quiet? 1, 2, 3. Loud.
Quiet.
Quiet? Oh, why do you say quiet?
Because I'm an introvert.
Got it.
Yeah, it's just the space I'm more comfortable in.
I think, I said loud, but I don't know what I was referring to. I like working in quiet spaces. Okay, we'll do 2 more. Okay, plane or train? Plane or train? 1, 2, 3. Plane. Train. You said plane, right?
Plane.
Yeah, am I the only one that said plane?
I said plane as well.
Okay.
I'm just a bit impatient.
Yeah. Also, I feel like there are a lot more options with plane.
That's true.
Yeah.
Okay, last one is song or dance? Song or dance? 1, 2, 3, dance.
Song.
Okay, and song, do you, either of you sing? No, but you like listening to songs?
Yeah. I love music, and I'm like, can you dance? Is there dancing without music? Would be question. There we go.
Shows that exists.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a big music person, which is weird, but I do like to dance.
Was that the last one? Is that another one?
That was the last one. I mean, there's more. I could say, do you want other ones?
Nice. I love these like super abstract concept questions. That's really cool.
So we have one more kind of activity, I guess, that we can do. So I'm going to share my screen. So we've never done this before, so just bear with us. And you will see an architectural project on the left, and on the right is architecture bingo. And the 3 of us are going to have a conversation about this project, and we want to make sure that we say all of these words as part of that conversation, so that we can be real architects who know architectural jargon, right? So
can I just ask about the definition of phenomenology?
Phenomenology.
Well, funny you ask, because that word is not definable in my experience.
Oh.
I think all of these words kind of mean nothing, right? They mean
yeah. You don't need to know what they mean. Just use them as though you knew what they meant.
Yeah.
But I think, anyway, yeah, I think that's basically it.
Well,
So this
phenomenology,
is
like, loosely refers to like I don't know, spatial experience, right?
how things look
Yeah.
and feel.
I mean, you mentioned this word earlier, Mark, and I sort of used my context clues to understand what you were talking about. This is the chance to really understand.
Well, I think, well, I don't know. I don't know much about it either. But it's one of these like stupid words used in architecture school. It's not stupid, I guess. Sorry, I'm gonna offend somebody. Okay, so should we start?
Yeah, so this is a Francis Carey project in,
Oh, Hannah has an answer. It's about the connection to place and space. Nice.
Connection to
That
place
makes sense.
and space. Okay. Is it place and space? Okay. I don't even know what it means. See? My ears went to sad ears. Okay, so
so this is a school and it's built out of brick. And then there's this,
do you think the brick was the catalyst in this project?
you know, it might have been.
This is so stupid.
But I think it's an appropriate use of material because you have something that is connected to the earth, but then up above, there's this really like exciting, you know, monumental moment with the roof.
Mm.
But
I really enjoy the rectilinear fenestration in this project.
oh, interesting. Yeah, the interstitial spaces between the windows really
Almost Corbusian, right?
almost. If they were just sequenced differently, I think it would have been exactly.
But the dichotomy of the groundedness of the brick and the levitation of the metallic, you know, roof structure is really powerful.
Mm. And the phenomenology is phenomenal.
Extraordinary, really.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for indulging, guys. So we have basically won the game.
That was quick because I knew you were going to say you were going to reference Corbusier because you always did in every single critique.
Oh my God.
Okay.
Like a drug. I'm trying to get off of Corbusier now.
Nice.
Well, that concludes our, I guess, sections. And thank you so much, Pulane, for joining us today. We are so grateful that you took out the time to talk about your work and to discuss architecture for the two of us.
Yeah,
thanks
this
for
was
joining.
really a lot of fun. I'm so happy we had this conversation. And I hope you guys will continue this post-pandemic as well.
I hope so too.
I think it's really important for, you know, for the profession for us to keep talking, especially these informal chats. I really miss this about design school, actually, just like the constant conversation. So this was awesome, guys. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining. Thanks other
everyone.
people as well. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, everyone.
Nish.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.